Ah, Georgia, nature's favorite state. Time to meet the farmers, producers, makers, and bakers who keep us fed and keep us coming back for more. Straight ahead at a fork in the road.
I came from the mud. There's dirt on my hands. Strong like a tree. There's roots where I stand.
Georgia farmers, artisans, merchants, and producers, we depend on these men and women every day of our lives through the choices we make and the food we consume. Their strategy and approach is always shifting, but the end game remains the same: results. Let's begin this episode down on the Georgia coast to meet a few of the players who make it all happen. This is Georgia's beautiful coast, the most protected stretch of marshland on America's eastern seaboard, a safe haven for nesting birds, and home to healthy, nutrient-rich water that harbors a perfect growing environment for this shelled Georgia-grown gem. Ernest McIntosh Sr. and Jr. have been farming these Georgia oysters for several years under the company name E.L. McIntosh & Sons Seafood, continuing a long family line of seafood production coming from these McIntosh County marshes.
It's a blessing to have someone to be able to carry it on. It make me feel like all what I've done in life, that it would continue going on.
You know, I've been raised in the commercial crabbing, and it's something we challenged to win at together. We got this opportunity, and it was like, I guess we were kind of like a two-headed man, you know. We was all together at the same thing. Oysters are a big part of clean water, clean air. One of these oysters filters, a big one, 50 gallons a day, so I mean, it's a good thing for us, and I wish there was more people interested in it than it is for the state, and I imagine we'll get there.
Oyster farming is it's just something different. It's work, but it's altogether different from what I've been doing over the years. Me and him butt heads sometime, but I have to listen to him because he's got a younger mind, and a lot of time he hit me with this new technology stuff, and it all works out.
These here are market ready. These will be the first one out of the farm when the season reopens.
You got to work to get looking like this now. This oyster is up off the bottom. It's not in the mud. It's oysters in racks and bags and stuff like that, and they filter clean water all the time. It's not filtering that mud. So the bacteria is much lesser in this oyster when you're growing it in the water column.
You ain't gonna just put this animal out there and expect for it to just go on its own, because it's not gonna be pretty. We keep a 3-day minimum a week out here with these guys, sometimes 4 days. And if you're trying to make a living at it and you want to be successful, you're gonna stay out here on this water behind it. A wild spat is any farmer's worst nightmare. That is a wild oyster larvae. So what that does is when the tide goes out, certain time of season, that wild oyster will put out that larvae. And as the tide goes out, it's trying to hold on to something before the water leaves it. So whatever it latches on there, it'll sit there and it'll grow. So you can imagine the millions of that in the water, and it hit one of these little bags here and attached to these little guys, and now you got a box here. You got a bag of oysters, or reef rather. You can't do nothing with it. But the opportunities is how much you want to work at it and be a good farmer, you know. If it ever gets that bad, you're not really interested in being a farmer.
These oysters look different than what you may be used to seeing. There's a golden brown glaze along the outer shell, and they are harvested individually, not clumped. And this is all by design. It's the result of a team of researchers, biologists, farmers, and chefs all sharing information, long hours, and a team passion for this amazing creature. Just a couple of counties north of Harris Neck lies Skidaway Island, home of the UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant, the birthplace of Georgia's first oyster hatchery. Tom Bliss is the director of UGA's Shellfish Research Lab and guides a dedicated team that is pioneering Georgia's oyster aquaculture.
We work with the oyster's natural cycle, so we bring the oysters in the spring, we conduct a spawn. Once they've spawned, we have to fertilize the eggs and then take care of the larvae all the way through their larval period until they become oysters, which they do during their setting period. So here in Georgia, our oysters grow in the intertidal, which causes them to grow tightly bound together in clumps. Those clumps are excellent for roast, but they're hard to break apart into single oysters that individuals like to be able to eat at a restaurant. So therefore, we've started adopting practices that have been developed elsewhere to grow them as a single oyster for wider distribution and actually easier to eat in many ways. And so to do that, you have to go to a more gear-intensive industry and use hatchery-produced oyster seed to make it a much easier process. Every oyster grown takes on the flavor of the water that it's in. So an oyster here from Georgia can look the same, but it can have a completely different taste than one from South Carolina or Virginia or the Gulf.
Justin Manley is the hatchery manager here on Skidaway and has played a major role in revolutionizing Georgia's oyster industry. He carefully watches over their maturity from spawn to the first several months of growth, a fascinating process to say the least.
We are trying to provide economic growth and stability to the industry. Seed forms the foundation of the oyster industry, and that's one thing the University of Georgia Marine Extension Georgia Sea Grant is trying to do, is help provide growers a stable environment to invest in developing their businesses. What we're doing right now is we're spawning oysters to produce oyster larvae. In nature, oysters are mass spawners, so they'll broadcast spawn eggs and sperm into the water column. And in the water column, fertilization occurs. And now I'm adding some live sperm to see if we can get something. The oysters will develop 14 to 21 days until they become competent. During this time, they develop an eye. They're about 200 microns in size. And they'll look for an adult oyster or some other form of substrate to settle on. What we do here is we spawn the oysters artificially using something called thermal induction, which is changing the water temperature from cold to hot, simulating a spring condition, which is a cue to them, a biological cue that they need to start spawning. So this is where we bring oysters to grow them here in the upland before they're moved out to growers in the field. So you can see how the water's coming through. You can't really see through it very well. It's because we have only a handful of oysters in this silo. We have about 50,000, okay? You can see they're a lot smaller than some of the other oysters we have in this upweller. These are larger oysters. They're able to clear that water out relatively quickly because of their size and their density, because oysters are filter feeders. What we're doing here is we are upwelling these oysters right now, so we're bringing raw water in from the estuary in through our tanks, and then it's returning back to the ocean again. It's bringing in oxygen and plenty of phytoplankton so they can grow. These oysters right here are for one of our growers, Ernest McIntosh, Yellow McIntosh and Son. They're currently our only oyster farmer. This is all his. I think we've got a little over 1 million oysters right here in this upweller at this time.
An oyster is indeed a shellfish, a living creature that needs to feed. And though they seem unaware and lifeless at first glance, there's a fascinating process that goes into feeding them appropriately. That's where Rob Hine comes into the story, along with his giant, bubbling, fluorescent tubes of algae.
It's very similar to horticulture. We just take small amounts of the algae and we'll move them into a larger vessel and add nutrients. Very similar how you would take a small plant that's getting a little root bound and you'd repot it into a bigger pot with more room, more soil, and then you would need to fertilize it as well. This is the same species of algae in different densities, and as the algae grows more and more, it becomes more and more dense, and so you can actually see the color change. So these are ready to either be fed or to be transferred into a larger size vessel like the one behind me. The exact growing region of an oyster does impact the flavor of the oyster and the quality of the oyster, which probably does have something to do with the native algae strains in that particular region.
Oysters naturally grow in clumps, creating giant fish-feeding mounds of shells all around these pristine marshlands and fluctuating tides. So growing these oysters individually and safe from predators is a challenge this team takes on every day. They learn the do's and don'ts the hard way, through experience, trial and error. So the farmer has fewer challenges on their end, in turn creating a more profitable product.
We're researching this to make it easier for people that are interested in it to get started in it. We've made a few mistakes ourselves, and it's very valuable to pass that information on to someone that might be wanting to get into it so they don't lose all their investment.
Rob, Justin, and the UGA Oyster Hatchery team keep a close relationship with the McIntoshes. These shellfish begin life on Skidaway, are then moved to the marshlands of McIntosh County in the good hands of the McIntosh oyster farming family, and from there, grown to perfection.
UGA gave us seeds, and we actually wanted to make those seeds grow. We failed a little bit, and once we caught on to how to make that oyster grow and make it look real good, it hadn't stopped since.
So as the industry grows, our hope is that we can help facilitate the growth of the commercial aspect, not only in the farming aspect, but also on the hatchery side.
It's an exciting yet challenging industry, but this team has come quite far and learned so much. Teamed with dedicated scientists and honest, hardworking farmers like the McIntoshes, the future is bright for an industry for these remarkable Georgia-born creatures. And though Ernest has yet to discover a pearl in one of these gold-glazed shells, perhaps the real gem is the oyster itself.
If you grow something and you're afraid to eat it yourself, then I mean, how do you think other people gonna feel? So they got certain months with it, but I know what I'm growing and how I'm taking care of it. It's salty.
Once they grow out right, I'm worse than a kid in a candy store when a beautiful one comes out the bunch. I mean, I love them.
From the coast to the city where these treasured oysters have found a fitting home. This old train depot that still hugs an active rail line is now a beautiful, highly acclaimed restaurant known as Kimball House. Located in the heart of Decatur, Georgia, this is a unique restaurant whose owners, from the start, have aimed to tailor a menu that reflects the farming seasons and greatly respect the farmers themselves.
We are focused on sustainability, sourcing, and making sure that what we're doing is the right thing for the people that we're leaving this restaurant to when we are gone. We buy oysters that are farmed from all four corners of the United States. We have a very rich focus here in the South as of a few years ago. I work with a nonprofit that's regional called Oyster South. We do a lot of fundraising, a lot of awareness, and a lot of promotion for aquaculture in the Southeast. And hopefully we are going to see some more stuff here in the state of Georgia in the next couple years. But right now we are proud to offer farmed oysters from Ernest McIntosh and his son Ernest. We've been selling them in our restaurant since 2017. It's 2 men, the season is short, they don't have a lot of opportunities to be in a lot of restaurants. So the fact that I get to work with the McIntosh family in this restaurant is honestly one of the most prideful things I get to do here at Kimball House.
There's somebody enjoying it across the table, man. That's what I love about him.
One of the things that farming gives you some control over is consistency. They might have some variation from shell to shell, but they're all basically the exact same size. The seafloor is going to have a profound effect on the color of the oyster. I find it interesting that they would take on this color. I would expect Georgia oysters to have kind of a darker color, but right now these are coming in with more of a reddish color. So this is Hero. Hero is a friend and colleague. He's been with Kimball House since I think probably a week or 2 before we opened was when he started training. He's by far the best shucker I've ever been around. So we're gonna utilize his skills so that we can shuck a few for you right now and show you how they're supposed to look. This is how we dress ours. We've got a mignonette that is apple cider vinegar and champagne vinegar that's infused with shallots and peppers, and then we also offer lemons. We just try to encourage people to eat oysters with as little additions as possible so they can experience what that water, where they were harvested, what that water tastes like. So when you eat this oyster, you are literally consuming the marshes of Georgia. Here's another thing that you get to experience.
What is that?
It's a pea crab.
Salty?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like popcorn. What I'm looking for mostly as an oyster shucker and an oyster eater is just an oyster that looks like it's been opened by someone who cares for the work that they're doing. That would mean that the mantle around the edge is not torn. It would mean that the belly doesn't have a hole in it. This should look like the cap blew off in the wind, which it does. It shouldn't look like it was forced open by a human with a knife. For this one, this black mantle around the edge there, I think is really cool. So when I get an opportunity to shuck one of those, I almost want to eat it before we even put it on a tray. So it's not really an indicator of that oyster is any better or any worse than the one next to it, but to me it's just really pretty when it's got that dark ring.
The oyster's taste speaks for itself, and the customers have responded. So the Yale McIntosh and Son oysters continue popular seasonal returns to the Kimball House menu year after year. And both Brian and the McIntoshes hope this solid Georgia industry and interest can grow.
That's a good color there.
You know, it's really nice to have this one singular Georgia oyster on the menu currently, and hopefully within the next 2 or 3 years we're able to bring on a lot more farmers. Our guests love them, and we can't wait to share that with them.
Now that we have explored the world of oysters in coastal Georgia, there's yet another shellfish here that's being grown and harvested along these gorgeous shores. These low-country back rivers and marshes in coastal Georgia are a national treasure. The beauty is easily seen from the surface, but there's an extra hidden gem underneath the waterline that you can only find when the moon says it's time. Seemingly hidden within Georgia's nutrient-rich waters and protected shores is a most fascinating world of clams.
These are called hard clams. We got started back in around 97, 98. UGA Marine Extension came and asked a friend of mine and I if we wanted to grow some clams. We said sure. And we learned how to kill a lot of clams first, and then after that we learned how to get them to live. So that's how we got started.
Sapelo Sea Farms grows and harvests the majority of clams coming out of the Georgia coast. They are growing in land most people never knew was even here. Four Mile Island is a massive flat of land that only appears clearly at low tide and is full of Charlie's happy little clams that spend approximately 2 years on the island and a few other selected marshland destinations for the big moment when they are dug up and cleaned up.
Where we are right now is 4 Mile Island, and it's a King's Grant deed. It's the only way you can own marsh in Georgia. So I actually own this, but I've got some state leases, I've got some private leases that I lease from people. Most of the clams I buy are 4 millimeters in size, so they're about the size of a small pea. And it takes me about 6 months to get them up to a grow-out clam, which is a clam about the size of your fingernail. And then I put them in another bag with a 9 millimeter hole, and they stay in that bag for about 18 months. So my clams are roughly 2 years old by the time I harvest them.
Nobody said clamming was clean. Charlie's crew will attest. Rain or shine, there's a job to do. However, flying across these back rivers and mudflats on a super-powered airboat that literally glides over both land and water, and watching this crew in action is an incredible experience and makes you appreciate the trade.
What they're doing now is they're washing the mud out of those clams so that we can handle them. And when they get back to the dock, they'll start pulling them out of the boat. They'll start tumbling them, getting the dead shell out. And in the morning, I'll be grading them and sorting them out for orders.
You can find these Georgia-grown Sapelo Sea Farm clams all over the country, but Charlie happens to serve them right off the boat at his own McIntosh County restaurant called The Fish Dock, where these fresh Georgia clams are served right on the water's edge.
I'm not a restaurant person, but I have learned, kind of like the clams, I learned a lot of stuff not to do first. We serve our clams, our wild oysters in season, and we've got snapper grouper boats, so we pull a lot of our fish and stuff for the restaurant from the local boats or shrimp from local shrimp boats.
It's always amazing to learn about a new industry and get to know the folks who have made a living out of something so foreign to the rest of the world. Eating tasty Georgia-grown clams is the easy part. The harvesting, well, we'll leave that to the folks of Sapelo Sea Farms who do it best. From oysters and clams and a fine dining restaurant that truly appreciates these farmers and their product, we now head back to the coast for our final course, and this may be the sweetest one yet. Time to meet Dale Potts, island chocolatier at the Sugar Marsh Cottage.
I decided I wanted to start a gourmet chocolate confection business. Darien was the inspiration for the company. We're located on historic Vernon Square, and this house was built in 1935. It's directly across from the Open Gates Bed and Breakfast, which was a timber baron's residence. I have had my eye on this house for 26 years. I knew that Sugar Marsh Cottage needed to land here. This property was available, and it became our production facility. So we took it to market. We exhibited at the Atlanta Gourmet Market in 2006. They have a little food competition at that show. So I decided you have to play to win. So we entered 3 products in the food competition, and our shortbread cookie took 3rd place for best dessert, our toffee took 3rd place for best chocolate, and our executive gift box, which we call the Island Box, took 1st place for best packaging. So we kind of knew that we had something.
Dale and her concoctions are definitely a coastal gem. Something that is and will always be made right here in Georgia.
All right, here we go. That is art. Dale, that is beautiful.
It is.
Toasting chocolates. Ah.
Beautiful.
From clammers and chocolatiers to a scientific exploration of a different breed of Georgia oyster, it's suffice to say that our coast offers an amazing diversity of culinary options. See you next time on a fork in the road.